From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
When Justice Scalia passed away suddenly last February, I made a promise to the American people. If I were elected president, I would find the very best judge in the country for the Supreme Court.
President Trump nominates conservative federal judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court.
Justice Scalia was a lion of the law. Agree or disagree with him, all of his colleagues on the bench cherish his wisdom and his humor. And like them, I miss him.
Senate Democrats have vowed to filibuster Gorsuch's nomination. We'll look at his record on the federal bench with Ian Millhiser of the Center for American Progress and Nan Aaron of the Alliance for Justice. Then we look at Steve Bannon, Trump's powerful aide credited with writing the controversial order closing the border to refugees and citizens of 7 Muslim nations. Is this just the beginning of Bannon's efforts to reshape the country's immigration laws?
Why stop until we vet? I don't understand. What do you mean vet? Why not just stop? Why are you going through all this thing on vetting? The opportunity cost of vetting.
The vetting's important because we don't know.
Why? No, you only vet. Commander. You only vet if you're going to let him in. Why even let him in?
We'll hear Bannon in his own words from his old Breitbart radio show and speak to Josh Harkinson of Mother Jones. And we'll talk to Reverend Jesse Jackson about why he opposes Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump has announced his nominee to replace the late Justice Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court. Judge Neil Gorsuch. Senate Democrats have vowed to filibuster the nomination of the conservative jurist as a judge on the 10th Circuit. Gorsuch ruled in favor of Hobby Lobby in the case deciding whether the company could refuse to provide birth control coverage to employees as required by Obamacare. Judge Gorsuch also has a long history of ruling against employees in cases involving federal race, sex, age, disability, and political discrimination and retaliation claims. Gorsuch reportedly upheld a decision that denied long-term insurance benefits to a worker who sustained a work-related injury that required spinal surgery. He also reportedly dissented from a ruling in favor of a truck driver whose employer illegally fired him for deserting a trailer so he wouldn't freeze to death. Gorsuch is a member of the ultra-conservative Federalist Society, which believes in severely restricting the power that federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, have to regulate businesses. Gorsuch's own mother, Ann Gorsuch Burford, briefly served as President Reagan's EPA administrator, where she slashed staff and eviscerated anti-pollution regulations before resigning amidst scandal. We'll have more on Judge Neil Gorsuch after headlines. Opposition to Donald Trump's cabinet nominations mounted on Capitol Hill and across the country Tuesday as Senate Democrats boycotted 2 scheduled committee votes, and dozens of people were arrested at a series of protests nationwide. Led by Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, Democratic lawmakers on the Senate Finance Committee stalled the confirmations of Treasury Secretary nominee Steven Mnuchin and Health and Human Services Secretary nominee Tom Price by refusing to attend the committee meeting. Under committee rules, if no Democrats attend the hearing, the committee cannot vote. The lawmakers accused Mnuchin and Price of lying to the committees during their nomination hearings. Amidst the Democratic boycott, protesters staged a sit-in to block the entrance to the office of Finance Committee Chair Orrin Hatch, the Republican senator from Utah, as a protest against Tom Price's nomination. At least 47 people were arrested. Democratic lawmakers on the Senate Judiciary Committee also delayed a vote on the confirmation of Senator Jeff Sessions for Attorney General Tuesday by making extended speeches. This is California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein.
Instead, he has been the fiercest, most dedicated, and most loyal promoter in Congress of the Trump agenda and has played a critical role in the clearinghouse for policy and philosophy to undergird the implementation of that agenda. With this in mind, I must vote no.
Senator Sessions' confirmation has faced a series of protests over his opposition to the Voting Rights Act and his history of making racist comments On Monday, about 30 members of the NAACP, including President Cornell William Brooks, were arrested at a sit-in at Sessions' office in Mobile, Alabama. It's the second NAACP sit-in against Sessions' confirmation where Brooks was arrested. On Tuesday, retired Army Colonel Ann Wright disrupted the Senate Judiciary Committee in protest of Sessions.
No to racism, no to the ban on refugees. Wait, oh, ow. Well, I'll go out, but you don't need to drag me. I've got a hip replacement. I'm 70 years old, and I can make it out on my own. But no to racism, no to hate, no to Jeff Sessions, no to the ban.
More protests against Senator Sessions and Trump's other cabinet nominations erupted Tuesday. In New York City, thousands of protesters gathered outside the home of Senator Chuck Schumer, calling on him to oppose Trump's cabinet picks. In a separate protest, also in New York, 11 protesters, including Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, were arrested blocking traffic outside Trump Tower to oppose the nominations. In Chicago, at least 7 protesters were arrested after hundreds staged a sit-in at the federal building to demand Illinois Senators Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth vote against billionaire Betsy DeVos for Education Secretary, which they did. Nevertheless, DeVos was among 3 of Trump's cabinet picks who were approved by Senate committees on Tuesday. The Senate Education Committee voted 12-11 to approve DeVos in a straight party vote, even though the Washington Post reports DeVos appears to have plagiarized parts of her written answers submitted to the Senate committee. Also on Tuesday, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee voted 16-7 to approve former Texas Governor Rick Perry as Energy Secretary and voted 16-6 to approve Montana Congressman Ryan Zinke to head the Interior Department. DeVos, Perry, and Zinke will now all face full Senate votes on their confirmation. The full Senate also voted Tuesday to confirm Elaine Chao to become Transportation Secretary. Protests also continued in cities nationwide against Trump's executive order temporarily banning all refugees as well as all citizens from 7 Muslim-majority nations: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen from entering the United States. In Minneapolis, an estimated 5,000 people flooded into the streets around the federal building. The anti-war committee, which organized the protests, said, quote, "It's criminal for the U.S. to bomb and attack other countries and then turn away refugees when the U.S. has destroyed their homelands," unquote. In Columbia, South Carolina, over 600 people gathered at the State House to denounce Trump's Muslim ban. Legal challenges to the ban also grew Tuesday as the states of Washington, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York all joined lawsuits against Trump's executive order. This is Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey.
The executive order is harmful, discriminatory, and unconstitutional. It discriminates on the basis of religion and national origin, denies our residents access to due process and equal protection of the law, and violates federal immigration law. The role of this office is to uphold the law and the Constitution of this state and of the United States.
As many as 1,000 State Department diplomats and officials have signed onto a dissent memo that condemns Trump's Muslim ban. That's far more signatures than any other dissent memo signed in recent years. On Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer tried to claim the executive order is not a ban. That's despite the fact that both Spicer and President Trump have repeatedly called the executive order a ban, including multiple times on Monday. On Tuesday, Spicer also tried to defend authorities' decision to handcuff a 5-year-old U.S. citizen for hours at Dulles International Airport in Virginia after the boy returned from a trip to Iran by claiming the boy could have posed a security threat. Trump has falsely claimed that only 109 people have been denied entry to the U.S. since the ban was imposed. In fact, officials with Customs and Border Protection said Tuesday at least 721 people have been denied entry into the United States. Among those who has been denied entry into the U.S. was a 75-year-old Iraqi-American green card holder named Naima. She fell ill during a family trip to Iraq and was then not allowed to return back to the U.S. for medical treatment following the executive order. She died a day after she was not allowed to board the plane. This is her son, Mike Hager, who lives in Detroit and is a U.S. citizen.
They destroyed us. I went with my family. I came back by myself. They destroyed our family. I was just shocked. I had to put my mom back to the on a wheelchair and take her back and call the ambulance. And she was very, very upset. She knew right there if we send her back to the hospital, she's going to pass away. She's not going to make it.
Mother had been living in the United States since 1995. President Trump has canceled his planned trip to Milwaukee amidst mass planned protests. The White House announced Tuesday Trump will not tour a Harley-Davidson factory Thursday, as scheduled, in response to the Milwaukee coalition against Trump. Said, quote, Trump's unpopular policies have ignited an unprecedented resistance movement that will block his every move. We hope our success in Milwaukee sets the tone for the rest of Trump's presidency. Wherever he goes, there will be resistance, unquote. More anti-protest laws are being pushed by lawmakers across the country amidst the wave of mass demonstrations against Donald Trump's presidency. In Iowa, lawmakers have introduced a bill that would make blocking traffic a felony punishable up to 5 years in prison. Minnesota lawmakers are pushing an anti-protest bill that would allow cities to sue protesters in order to charge them for the cost of policing the demonstrations. In North Dakota, lawmakers have introduced a bill that would allow drivers to accidentally run over and kill protesters blocking traffic. Washington state lawmakers are pushing a bill that would label protests as economic terrorism. And in Indiana, Republican legislators have introduced a bill that would empower police to remove protesters blocking traffic using any means necessary legislation activists have dubbed the Block Traffic and You Die bill. The new bills come as more than 200 activists are facing up to 10 years in prison on felony riot charges for protesting against Donald Trump's inauguration in Washington, D.C. In Romania, over 20,000 people protested in the capital Bucharest and other cities across the country after the government passed an emergency ordinance decriminalizing official misconduct. Protesters say the move sanctions corruption. This is one of the protesters.
We came to protest against these immoral and mafia-type government methods. They're voting in the night like thieves, a law which gives a right to steal 44,000 euros to the politicians and public officers who are serving them.
Back in the United States, Republican lawmakers have introduced new legislation that proposes to sell off 3.3 million acres of public land, an area about the size of the state of Connecticut. The land spans 10 different states. The bill is being pushed by Utah Republican Congressman Jason Chaffetz. And the Army Corps of Engineers appears poised to approve the final permit required to build the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, which has faced months of resistance from hundreds of indigenous nations and non-native allies. On Tuesday, North Dakota Senator John Havens said he'd spoken with Acting Secretary of the Army Robert Speer, and that Speer has directed the Corps to issue the easement for Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the pipeline, to drill underneath the Missouri River. The Standing Rock Sioux and many more fear a pipeline spill could contaminate the river, which serves as a drinking source for millions. Water protectors say if the easement is granted, the government would be illegally circumventing the process of an environmental impact statement, which was ordered in December under President Obama's administration. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe said, quote, to abandon the environmental impact statement would amount to a wholly unexplained and arbitrary change based on the president's personal views and potentially personal investments, unquote. Members of the resistance camp Sacred Stone on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota have called for water protectors to come to support the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a primetime address on Tuesday night, President Donald Trump announced his pick for the Supreme Court to replace the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who died nearly a year ago.
Millions of voters said this was the single most important issue to them when they voted for me for president. I am a man of my word. I will do as I say, something that the American people have been asking for from Washington for a very, very long time. Today, thank you. Today, I am keeping another promise to the American people by nominating Judge Neil Gorsuch of the United States Supreme Court to be of the United States Supreme Court.
Neil Gorsuch is a 49-year-old federal judge, member of the Federalist Society, widely seen as a conservative jurist. Trump was able to nominate Scalia's replacement only because the Republican-led Senate refused to consider Obama's nominee for the post. On March 16th last year, Obama nominated Garland, but Republican senators refused to hold confirmation hearings. As a judge on the 10th Circuit, Neil Gorsuch ruled in favor of Hobby Lobby in the case deciding whether the company could refuse to provide birth control coverage to employees as required by Obamacare. Judge Gorsuch also has a long history of ruling against employees in cases involving federal race, sex, age, disability, and political discrimination and retaliation claims. Senate Democrats have vowed to filibuster his nomination. During remarks last night, Judge Gorsuch described Antonin Scalia as a lion of the law.
For the last decade, I've worked as a federal judge in a court that spans 6 Western states, serving about 20% of the continental United States and about 18 million people. The men and women I've worked with at every level in our circuit are an inspiration to me. I've watched them fearlessly tending to the rule of law, enforcing the promises of our Constitution, and living out daily their judicial oaths to administer justice equally to rich and poor alike, following the law as they find it and without respect to their personal political beliefs. I think of them tonight. Of course, the Supreme Court's work is vital not just to a region of the country, but to the whole, vital to the protection of the people's liberties under law and to the continuity of our Constitution, the greatest charter of human liberty the world has ever known. The towering judges that have served in this particular seat of the Supreme Court, including Antonin Scalia and Robert Jackson, are much in my mind at this moment. Justice Scalia was a lion of the law. Agree or disagree with him, all of his colleagues on the bench cherish his wisdom and his humor. And like them, I miss him.
To talk more about Judge Gorsuch, we are going to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by 2 guests. Ian Millhiser is Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, the editor of Think Progress Justice. His new article is titled, Who is Neil Gorsuch? He's also author of the book Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. We are also joined by Nan Aaron, who is president of Alliance for Justice. Ian Millhiser, let's begin with you. Your overall response to President Trump's choice of Judge Gorsuch to be the next Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, I mean, this is a terrible pick. This is someone who will probably be to Scalia's right. Scalia was very bad on choice. I think that Gorsuch will match that. Scalia was bad on issues like birth control. Gorsuch will match that. But in addition to that, what makes Gorsuch very unusual is that he wants to dismantle the deference that courts have typically played to federal agencies. It's a very technical issue, but it's also very important. It goes to whether or not, when the people elect a Democratic president, that Democratic president is going to be able to protect the environment, to protect workers, to make wages go up, or whether they're going to be at the mercy of a Republican-controlled court. So his primary agenda is to shift power towards the judiciary at the very moment that the Republican Party is consolidating its control over the judiciary. And I think that that leads us to some very dangerous places.
He has been hailed as a man who is deeply erudite, a great writer, a classmate of President Obama at Harvard Law School. This crossed the spectrum. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, he's a very smart guy, and I mean, to some extent, that's what makes him dangerous. You know, this is someone who is going to, with great precision, with great intelligence, look for ways to implement a very conservative agenda, and that person, frankly, scares me more than someone who's dumb. I mean, this guy is extraordinarily competent, extraordinarily talented, and he's going to put all of considerable brain power towards implementing a very right-wing agenda.
Neil Gorsuch wrote in an essay in 2005 for the National Review in which he said, quote, American liberals have become addicted to the courtroom, relying on judges and lawyers rather than elected leaders and the ballot box as the primary means of affecting their social agenda on everything from gay marriage to assisted suicide to use of vouchers for private school education. He continued, this overweening addiction to the courtroom as the place to debate social policy is bad for the country and bad for the judiciary. Ian Millhiser, your response.
I would feel better if the views that he expressed in that article matched what his record on the bench, because at least if he's saying that the court should be less involved generally, that means that when liberals want something, they don't get it, but when conservatives want something, they don't get it either. What I've seen from Gorsuch is something else. What I've seen from Neil Gorsuch is that when liberals want something, regardless of whether there's precedent in their favor, he's looking for ways to dismantle those precedents. And when conservatives want something, he's going out of their way to give them their wish list. And that's even scarier than someone who just wants to dismantle the court's role in society.
Reproductive rights, Ian.
Well, as you said, he voted the wrong way in Hobby Lobby to say that a woman's boss has a degree of control over their access to birth control. He also went out of his way to try to defund Planned Parenthood in a very odd case in which he used the court's rules in a way that they're really not supposed to be used. So I don't think there's any question that not only is he going to vote the way that he voted in Hobby Lobby over and over again, but that he is anti-choice and will vote to dismantle Roe.
What do you mean on the Planned Parenthood front? Can you explain what that case was?
Sure. So it was actually a fairly minor case. There was a question of whether or not Planned Parenthood's funds could be cut off by the Utah governor. And the reason I call it a minor case is because it was really just a case about the governor's motivation. It was a totally fact-based inquiry. There was no grand legal question in play. And Gorsuch invoked a process that's used to make the whole court hear a case. It's typically only invoked, it's only invoked very rarely, and when it is, it's because there is some sort of grand legal principle at place. So the fact that he would try to do this in a case that legally was very small, even though obviously politically it matters a great deal what happens to Planned Parenthood, suggests to me that he is willing to use every tool at his disposal, and he's willing to break with traditions and break with ordinary process in order to push an agenda that's going to restrict access to reproductive rights.
Neil Gorsuch has long opposed assisted suicide, which his home state of Colorado legalized last year. He wrote a 2006 book called The Future of Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia. In it, he outlines his argument for retaining current laws banning assisted suicide and euthanasia, saying, quote, all human beings are intrinsically valuable and the intentional taking of human life by private persons is always wrong. What is the significance of this, Ian Millhiser, both on assisted suicide and what it means for reproductive rights?
Right. I mean, it's significant because it tells you immediately what he'll do in an assisted suicide case. But obviously the rhetoric that he uses there is the rhetoric that abortion opponents are using. The anti-choice rhetoric is to present the fetus as a human life and say that exactly what Neil Gorsuch said about human life in his book. So when you look at his full record, his vote in Hobby Lobby, his vote in the Planned Parenthood case, his adoption of the rhetoric of people who call themselves pro-life, I think it's very, very clear what he's going to do when he has an abortion case in front of him.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion with Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at Center for American Progress Action Fund and editor of Think Progress Justice, and Nan Aaron, President of Alliance for Justice. Stay with us.
He swivels his head, tears his eyes from the screen, as his past puts him back in Atlantic City. There's not even a demon in heaven or hell. Is it all just human disguise as I walk down the aisle? And I'm gone, now I'm old to the movies, and I know who's there when silhouettes fall. And I'm gone, like I'm dancing on angels, and I'm gone through the crack in the past, like a dead man walking, like a dead man walking.
Dead Man Walking, David Bowie here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're continuing to look at Judge Neil Gorsuch, President Trump's nominee to the Supreme Court. We're joined by Nan Aaron, President of Alliance for Justice. Still with us, Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice. Nan Aaron, when you saw the pick announced in a kind of reality TV way, no one knew who it was going to be. But at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, President Obama announced that Neil Gorsuch was his choice, and he came out with his wife. Gorsuch did. Talk about your response and what you are most concerned about right now.
Well, we expected either Neil Gorsuch or Tom Hardiman, and probably Neil Gorsuch by the afternoon was considered the front runner. I would say we were obviously very disappointed, but not surprised. The events of the past several weeks have added new urgency to this discussion and to the debate that will ensue over the Supreme Court. We now know we have a president, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Mike Pence, who would love to dismantle the social, economic, political progress made in this country for over 100 years. And what is so critically important at this particular moment in time is to have courts, and in particular a Supreme Court, that can operate as an independent check on the president's powers, excesses, and even impulses. So I'd say this discussion, this focus on the court, is critically important because, after all, while Donald Trump will be in office 4 years, 8 years, Supreme Court justices are on the court for life. And so this inquiry that will be taken by the Senate is really an important one, is an awesome one. But at the end of the day, we do know Neil Gorsuch. We know his record. And yes, he's very smart. Yes, he's very collegial. But that's not the end of the inquiry when you consider a Supreme Court justice. What you need to look at is the record, as Ian has done and we have done. And it shows an individual who will limit the ability of government to protect Americans' air, water, medicines, food, weaken workers' rights, civil rights, limit abortion, do away with abortion. He's even criticized the courts for advancing LGBTQ rights. So this is a man who is really out of sync with America at the moment. He's not out of sync with Heritage Action. He's not out of sync with the Federal Society.
Explain what the Federal Society is.
The Federal Society is an organization principally of law students, law teachers, lawyers, funded in part by the Koch brothers, who espouse a very limited role for the courts. Their view is the courts can't protect, can't safeguard, won't allow our agencies to ensure that we've got protections, which really places people's lives in peril. It is considered a right-wing organization, And in fact, the Trump administration outsourced the selection of its judges and Neil Gorsuch to the Federal Society and Heritage Action. A very sad phenomenon at the moment. We also know that this president, as stated several times during the campaign, was looking for an individual who would both expand gun rights and overturn Roe versus Wade. So we know that the president is very assured that Neil Gorsuch will complement, will carry out, will implement his agenda on those two things. But there's even more to be worried about, and that is really the ability of our government and its agencies to provide protection for all Americans.
Ian Millhiser, Judge Gorsuch was a clerk for Anthony Kennedy, another Supreme Court justice. There was discussion that because Anthony Kennedy would feel so comfortable with Judge Gorsuch at his side, that he might be more willing to retire, which would mean President Trump chooses another Supreme Court justice. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, Lord, I hope not. I mean, here's the thing. Anthony Kennedy is conservative, but he's much more moderate than Neil Gorsuch. And Anthony Kennedy does have a libertarian streak. You know, he's supportive of some restrictions on police. He, sometimes votes with the liberals in criminal justice cases. I think that he is cautious about executive power, and he might be particularly cautious about this executive's power, and he's also good on gay rights. So when you look at Anthony Kennedy's record, a lot of what he cares about is going to be lost if he gives his seat to Donald Trump. He's not going to be giving it to Neil Gorsuch. He's going to be giving it to whoever Donald Trump picks. And so, I'm not a mind reader. Only Anthony Kennedy can know what Anthony Kennedy is thinking. But I hope that he realized that he is the only thing standing between Donald Trump right now and Trump being able to do more or less whatever he wants. And if he wants to continue to be a check on this president, he needs to not give the president his seat on the Supreme Court.
I also want to ask about what happened last year with Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee to replace Scalia after he died. This is President Obama speaking last March when he made the nomination.
Simply ask Republicans in the Senate to give him a fair hearing, and then an up or down vote. If you don't, then it will not only be an abdication of the Senate's constitutional duty, it will indicate a process for nominating and confirming judges that is beyond repair. The reputation of the Supreme Court will inevitably suffer. Faith in our justice system will inevitably suffer. And our democracy will ultimately suffer as well.
That was President Obama last March when he nominated Merrick Garland. Nan Aaron, the significance of what took place over this last year.
I can hear you guys all right.
Our senators, the American people, are just anguished over the mistreatment of Merrick Garland by Republicans. Here you had a nominee who enjoyed support from both Democrats and Republican senators, had a moderate record, and in fact, not one Republican senator during the time they blocked a hearing and a vote indicated that he or she had any particular criticisms of his record. So here you had a sterling candidate with a sterling record, and yet Republicans failed to give him a hearing, failed to give him a vote, hoping a Republican president would be voted into office, and that president would then name his own Supreme Court justice. And of course, that's exactly what happened. But it's important to note that not one Republican senator last year criticized anything about Merrick Garland's record. So it was just simply a disgraceful, a shameful abuse of power. And the Senate will remember it, but it's important to know and to note that the Senate will not act on the basis of tit for tat, on what happened to Merrick Garland. That's the past. The Senate should be focused and will be focused on Neil Gorsuch's record and whether or not he is the proper, appropriate person to take a seat on that Supreme Court. That is what this discussion and this debate will focus on.
Very quickly,
not Merrick Garland.
Very quickly, Ian Millhiser, on environmental issues. This Colorado jurist, Neil Gorsuch, explain his position on Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, and also whether you think his mother, Ann Gorsuch, who was the first woman EPA administrator, fiercely anti-regulation, ultimately forced out over a corruption scandal, has relevance here.
Well, I mean, I am cautious about imputing the views of the mother to the son, but when you look at Neil Gorsuch's record, it looks like the apple did not fall far from the tree here. What this Chevron case is, the Chevron doctrine is basically a doctrine of modesty. It says that courts should recognize that they're not elected, and they should defer to much of what the agencies do when those agencies try to do their job. What's going to happen if Gorsuch succeeds in dismantling Chevron is it's going to shift power from the federal agencies, which are responsible to an elected president, to the unelected judiciary at the moment when Republicans are consolidating their control over the judiciary. And that means that if 4 years from now there's a Democratic president, that Democratic president could find it very hard to govern, could find it very hard to put environmental regulations in place, very hard to put labor regulations in place, because every time they want to do it, they have to ask permission from Neil Gorsuch.
And that issue of labor, his stand in cases on labor rights.
Well, this Chevron issue goes to virtually any subject. I mean, if you look at how President Obama governed, largely due to gerrymandering, it was impossible for him to for Democrats to take back the House. And so he had to look to the regulatory agencies. And so he tried to fight global warming through the agencies. He tried to expand access to overtime pay through the agencies. He tried to prevent LGBT discrimination through the agencies. And if Gorsuch gets his way on Chevron, the next Democratic president is going to lose all of that power, or at the very least is going to have to go begging for permission to a Republican-controlled court every time they want their agencies to do some sort of regulatory action.
I just wanted to read very quickly from the New York Daily News and get your response, Ian. President Trump's nominee to the Supreme Court expressed disdain for apartheid protesters in a series of columns published by a Columbia University newspaper, and one time had to retract a fabricated story about a student activist, the Daily News has learned. Neil Gorsuch, who was nominated by Trump Tuesday night, graduated from the Ivy League school, and it's Columbia, in 1988 with a political science degree. While enrolled, Gorsuch penned columns for the Columbia Daily Spectator about what he perceived as liberal bias plaguing the student body. In one column, Gorsuch blasted student coalitions protesting American companies profiting off of South Africa's segregationist apartheid system. Now, this is when he was very young, but your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I am cautious about imputing the beliefs that people had in college to who they are as an adult. I think that if any of my college friends knew that I was appearing on this show, they would be shocked to learn that. So people do change. But when you look at Neil Gorsuch's record, I think it's pretty clear from how he has behaved as an adult, as in a judge, that he still holds a very conservative ideology, and that, you know, when you look at his record from when he was in college, it's clear that he's held very conservative views for a very long time.
Well, Ian Millhiser, I won't ask why they would be shocked, but thank you very much for joining us. Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund and the editor of Think Progress Justice, and Nan Aaron, President of Alliance for Justice. When we come back, we take a look at Stephen Bannon, who has become the top aide to President Trump. Stay with us.
There'll be no rest for the wicked. There's no song for the quiet. There's no hope for the weary. You let them win without a fight. If one heart can mend another, only then can we begin. So won't you hold on a little longer? Don't let them get away.
Licky Lee, no rest for the wicked. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As protests continue across the country and globe over Donald Trump's order closing the borders to refugees and citizens of 7 majority Muslim nations, we turn to look at the man largely credited with writing the executive order, Stephen Bannon, Trump's chief strategist. Over the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration, Bannon has emerged as one of the most powerful figures in the White House. On Tuesday, the New York Times ran an editorial posing the question, President Bannon? The Times wrote, quote, "We've never witnessed a political aide move as brazenly to consolidate power as Stephen Bannon, nor have we seen one do quite so much damage so quickly to his putative boss's popular standing or pretenses of competence," unquote. Bannon is the former head of Breitbart News, a site that's been described as an online haven for white nationalists. He left the job in August to run Trump's campaign. Last week, Trump took the unprecedented step of giving Bannon a full seat on the Principals Committee of the National Security Council. While Bannon has given few interviews since Trump's election, many journalists have been scouring the archives of Breitbart, where Bannon once hosted a radio show. In a piece today, The Washington Post highlights a program from 2015 when Bannon questioned Republican Congressman Ryan Zinke, who's now Trump's nominee to the Interior Secretary. This is Steve Bannon.
There's a level of frustration and anger here in the United States that we're not prosecuting this war, and we're actually in discussions about bringing over Muslim refugees into this country with a president who's now mocking the talk radio people, mocking the audience on talk radio, mocking the sites like Breitbart that are bringing up these issues. What say you?
Well, I think we need to do two things, or 3 things. One is we need to put a stop on refugees until we can vet. You know, we've been through a number of classified briefings.
Why stop until we vet? I don't understand. What do you mean vet? Why not just stop? Why are you going through all this thing on vetting? The opportunity cost of vetting.
Well, vetting's important because we don't know. Why?
No, you only vet, Commander, you only vet if you're going to let him in. Why even let him in?
So that's Stephen Bannon interviewing Ryan Zinke in 2015. In another program from 2015, Bannon interviews Senator Jeff Sessions, Trump's nominee to be the Attorney General. Sessions praised a 1924 immigration law which imposed a racist quota system. This is Stephen Bannon.
As it exists today, with the current laws in the books, right? This is not passing Gang of 8, correct? This is what our current laws in the books would actually allow to happen. That we would have at the end of this time period, 50 years, you'd basically have an increase in the population of 115 million people, 14 million basically from the native-born population, and 103 million would actually come from outside.
In 7 years, we'll have the highest percentage of Americans non-native born since the founding of the Republic. And some people think, well, we've always had these numbers, but it's not so. This is very unusual. It's a radical change. And in fact, when the numbers reached about this high in 1924, the President and Congress changed the policy, and it slowed down immigration significantly. and we then assimilated through the 1965 and created really the solid middle class of America with assimilated immigrants, and it was good for America. And then we passed a law that went far beyond what anybody realized in 1965, and we're on a path now to surge far past what the situation was in 1924.
That was Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who now could be voted to be the Attorney General, being interviewed by Steve Bannon in 2015. To talk more about Bannon, we're joined by Josh Harkinson, senior reporter at Mother Jones. His recent article headlined "The Dark History of the White House Aides Who Crafted Trump's Muslim Ban." Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Josh. Can you lay out who Stephen Bannon is, and then we'll ask you about Stephen Miller.
Well, I think at heart, Stephen Bannon is a nationalist who, he turned Breitbart News into an empire that is really one of the preeminent platforms for the alt-right, as he told us back this last summer. And he is deeply opposed to Islam on many levels, but he is basically a demagogue, in the mold of those from past eras. And I, think he's risen to power within the Trump administration based on his ability to inflame racial fears and xenophobia.
Talk about what happened this weekend. The ban through 2 executive orders that now the press secretary, Sean Spicer, is saying is not a ban, although he himself used the term many times, as did President Trump.
Right. And if you, as we did at Mother Jones, we looked at his radio interviews shortly after he became Trump's campaign manager back last summer. And he has a long history of interviewing anti-Islam activists and promoting this paranoid vision of Islam as a religion bent on the destruction of Western civilization. And so I think in that context, there is no doubt that this policy is really about preventing Muslims from coming into the United States.
I want to turn to a talk that Stephen Bannon delivered via Skype in a conference held inside the Vatican in 2014. He talked about the crisis that capitalism confronts in the West and the war against Islamic fascism.
I believe the world, and particularly the Judeo-Christian West, is in a crisis. And it's really the organizing principle of how we built Breitbart News to really be a platform to bring news and information to people throughout the world, principally in the West, but we're expanding internationally, to let people understand the depths of this crisis. And it is a crisis both of capitalism, but really of the underpinnings of the Judeo-Christian West in our beliefs. We are in an outright war against jihadist Islamic fascism. And this war is I think, metastasizing almost far quicker than governments can handle it.
So there is Stephen Bannon in an address in a conference inside the Vatican a few years ago. The significance, Josh Harkinson, of what he's saying here.
Well, as you're probably aware, President Obama declined to even use the term Islamic terrorism. But here you have Stephen Bannon framing the battle against terrorism as a religious war, which is exactly what radical terrorists want. They want to present themselves as the representatives of Islam, when in fact it is a religion of millions of people that is very moderate. And that's evident in our allies in the Islamic world and their approach to governance. But Stephen Bannon is really, in this sense, playing into the hands of actual terrorists.
So let me ask you about this most recent information that has come out, that he has been made a principal on the National Security Council. What exactly this means? This man who came out of Goldman Sachs, who is the head of Breitbart News, a news haven for white supremacists and nationalists. What is he doing on the National Security Council, and the significance of this, as well as the demoting of 2 of the traditional positions on the National Security Council, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford, as well as the Director of National Intelligence, currently those two positions?
Right, and this is really unprecedented. David Axelrod, Obama's political advisor, sometimes sat in on these meetings, but he had nothing close to a permanent position. And Bannon's elevation, while these other officials are demoted, really tells us that he's going to be playing a key role here on this council, which should be deeply disturbing, not just because of his radical ideology, his views on Islam, but also because he's a political operative. And his MO has always been to use policy as an arm of politics, as an arm of winning over his adversaries. And so it's scary. I mean, he could start a war just for political gain.
It's interesting to hear David Axelrod's response to Sean Spicer, who said he's being no different than David Axelrod for Obama, who is his political advisor. He'd walk in and out of NSC meetings. We're just making ourselves transparent, to which David Axelrod responded, it's amazing to go to sleep and wake up as an alternative fact. He said, I did not participate in these meetings. Sometimes I would go in to hear what people were saying, for example, about Afghanistan. But he said it's certainly very different from being a principal at the table.
Right, and I think that's the key point. Bannon is really, I mean, look at his behavior at Breitbart News, where he had no qualms about using xenophobia to gain readers and clout, and I think his behavior. He also has a famously confrontational style, where he loves he views himself at war with his adversaries. He has a very black and white view of the world. And so, this suggests that he will encourage Trump to clash even more than he already does with foreign leaders around the world.
I'd like to turn to comments Bannon also made about the media in that interview last week with the New York Times, where he said the media should be embarrassed and humiliated and keep its mouth shut and just listen for a while. Bannon added, I want you to quote this, the media here is the opposition party. They don't understand this country. They still don't understand why Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Very quickly, Josh.
Yeah, so this war against the media is, a classic authoritarian tactic, discrediting the people who tell you what's going on in the world, questioning their authority to give you the facts, which, causes basically the people to not know what's up and what's down, to question, and so then that allows him to do whatever he wants with impunity, ultimately.
And quickly, Stephen Miller. Who exactly he is, this former head chief of staff of Senator Sessions, who's now one of the top advisors to President Trump.
Yeah, Stephen Miller is an interesting guy. He's very young. He's 31 years old. He was, formerly Jeff Sessions' top aide, and has been described as having a mind meld with Sessions. Is very much opposed to multiculturalism and is a nativist in the Sessions strain. And he has a history from his earliest days in politics at Duke University, where he was a columnist at the campus newspaper, of writing these op-eds that are just very far right and appealing to basically he is a mini Steve Bannon. He's a demagogue in training, essentially. And his relationship with Richard Spencer, the well-known white supremacist. Exactly. So he and Richard Spencer, who I spent a lot of time with a few months ago, were both members of the Duke Conservative Union, and they worked together to bring Peter Brimelow, a very influential white nationalist, the head of the group VDARE, to campus to talk about immigration issues. And Spencer told me basically that he felt he was a mentor to Miller. Miller vehemently denies this, but other members of the Duke Conservative Union told me that they did work together on this event. Well, Josh Harkinson, I want to thank you for being with us. We're certainly going to link to your piece at Mother Jones. The piece is headlined, The Dark History of the White House Aides Who Crafted Trump's Muslim Ban. As we spend the rest of the show with a civil rights leader who's been at the forefront of the movement for equality for decades, Reverend Jesse Jackson. I
caught up with the two-time Democratic presidential candidate at the Women's March in Washington, and now he joins us here in New York. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Good morning.
We just have a few minutes, and then we're going to do part 2 of this discussion. But let's focus right now on Jeff Sessions and the opposition to him. They've put off the vote on him until today. The head of the NAACP just got arrested again this week with scores of others.
Reasons. He represents a constriction of democracy. You know, in 1965, blacks didn't have the right to vote for 85 years. White women couldn't serve on juries. 18-year-olds could not vote, though serving in Vietnam. You couldn't vote on campus. You couldn't vote bilingually. He calls the intervention of the Supreme Court to protect people's rights as an intrusion. He also calls the 54th decision to end segregation as a matter of law an activist court. So he would be a dangerous person to be over justice.
And the significance of Sessions being questioned by, well, you had Cory Booker, the first time a sitting senator challenged a sitting senator and before the Senate Judiciary Committee in a confirmation hearing. John Lewis, one of the most respected Congress members, longtime civil rights activist, as well as Congressmember Cedric Richmond, who questioned why these 3 men spoke not at the beginning of the hearing, as is customary when senators or congressmen address a committee, but at the end, saying we feel like we're at the back of the bus.
Well, they were. And after all, such as it's not enough to call them like racist, but some combination of Federalist Society and the Confederates. He has a point of view about women and labor and people of color, and it's a very dangerous point of view. And it is the most powerful job in the country, just like Tillerson, the most powerful job as Secretary outside the country. It would stick a knife in the crown jewel of Dr. King's work, inhibiting the protected right to vote.
So what do you think should happen? The vote has not yet taken place. You're a man who's long engaged in civil disobedience, not to mention other kinds of protest.
Well, I think that the senators have an obligation, one, to stand tall against his nomination. And even those Republicans who dare see a one big tent democracy, those who see the world through a door, not through a keel, even they have an obligation to break ranks because they cannot justify their ignoring his record to vote for him in the name of, they cannot choose party unity over patriotism or what's good for the country.
Donald Trump calling John Lewis all talk, 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 no action.
Well, we should get beyond the name calling. Obviously, John Lewis is about action and change. We are a better nation because of the sacrifice of John Lewis and Hosea Williams and James Orange and Dr. King. We are a bigger, better nation because of their involvement, and that all is right now on the chopping block. And so it's a dark period, but we must not surrender our spirits.
Your response to the choice of Neil Gorsuch to be the next Supreme Court justice?
It's not enough to call them conservative. Constriction of women's rights. Women are not going to allow any longer their bodies to be controlled by someone else. Women have the right to own their own bodies. That's a dimension. But it's not just women's rights. It's women's rights. It's workers' rights. It's the rights of consumers. He is to the right of Scalia, and that itself should say an awful lot about the attempt to color the court.
And finally, the Muslim ban. People protesting all over the country right through today.
And the world. With the stroke of the pen, we ushered ourselves into isolation. When you push off on the Mexicans in Latin America, 2/3 of our hemisphere, you push off on China with the China policy issue, which is 1/4 of the Asian race in the world today. You push off on Europe and make them unsettled about NATO vis-a-vis Putin, and you push off on refugees. With the one stroke of the pen, you put America in a moral and political isolationist position. We're made less secure by that ban. Less secure, not more secure.
Well, Reverend Jackson, I want to thank you for being with us.
And it is a ban.
So you agree with Donald Trump and Sean Spicer on that one.
That's what they said.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, longtime civil rights leader and presidential candidate. That does it for today's broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.